All right, we're here with Fletcher Prouty, and it is now May 6th, 1989, beginning a series of questions regarding his book published in 1973 by Prentice Hall called The Secret Team. One of the most essential parts of post-World War II American political action and agendas seem to hinge on events that happened immediately after World War II. With the passage of the National Security Act of 1947, why don't you discuss the original intent of Congress of the role of the CIA as specified in this law?
It's very important in trying to discuss the National Security Act of 1947 to be sure that we go back into the spirit and the thinking of the time. We had just ended the greatest world war ever fought in late 1945 with the surrender of the Japanese on September 2nd, 1945. Early in 1946, President Truman abolished the OSS. There was no longer a need for an operating organization of that type now that the war was over. But there were assets of the OSS, primarily such things as agents lists, who the agents worked with, and other activities like that you just can't abandon. They have to be taken care of. And these were placed in an office which was concealed in the State Department for quite a while. And also, President Truman, by presidential directive, created the National Intelligence Group and placed it under General Vandenberg, Army officer, but later the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, who had a considerable experience with intelligence matters. Both of these acts by President Truman were more or less standby. He knew that there would have to be some change in the law to act on these intelligence matters. At that time also, you'll remember that the Soviet Union had been our ally during the war, was not a stated enemy as it became very shortly after that. So that the National Security Act of 1947, written, the language of the law, written during 1946, was based pretty much on the reality of World War II and not upon the Cold War realities. Now, for those of us looking back, that's kind of hard to think about because we have so ingrained in us now the fact that the Soviet Union is the enemy, communism is the enemy, and that the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians, who were our enemy in World War II, are all now friends. So you must go back into that era and begin there when you talk about the origins of CIA and the passage of this very important law, the National Security Act of 1947. Because I was teaching a major course, a year-long course at Yale called The Evolution of Warfare, I was very interested, of necessity interested, in these activities of 1946 and 47 as part of my course. So I read everything I could get from the congressional hearings, from the newspapers, everything that was going in those years toward the creation of this law, this new law. What you could see was some rather practical things, and then you could see some indications of things that were going to come. First of all, the Army and Navy had to share their aviation interests with a new branch of the service, the Air Force. That was one of the things that the public recognized about this new law. We created then a single Department of Defense. We hadn't had one. And many of the many of the officers that had fought World War II did not like this term Department of Defense. There's a very basic distinction, especially in warfare, but in athletics, in sports, in competition, between being on the offense and being on the defense. On the offense, you know what you're doing. On the offense, you're planning something. If you're on the offense with a Department of War, as we used to have, it doesn't mean you're planning to fight, but it means you're ready to fight, and you let everybody know that. If you're on the Department of Defense, you're waiting for somebody else to make a move, and then you react. the philosophy of the entire military structure of this country changed with this business of the Department of Defense. And coming as it did right when we were the most powerful nation in the world, with an enormous Army, Navy, and Air Force, and the nuclear weapon, which nobody else had in that period, to put all of that on the defense was an enormous oversight. And those of us who were close to all that felt it that way. There was no way to say that the World War II armies of the United States were to go on the defense. That destroyed really the structure of the Army, and a lot of people on active service felt that at that time. I say that because this business of the communist, anti-communist bit, and the idea of a Department of War or Department of Navy as against Department of Defense, another major thing, was then joined by this new idea of a Central Intelligence Agency. Now, one of the problems during World War II was not that we did not have enough intelligence. It was that it wasn't coordinated. The intelligence that General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz had in the Pacific was not always coordinated with the intelligence that General Eisenhower and General Bradley and their allies had in the European theater. And a lot of times Washington had different intelligence from different sources and didn't have the means to coordinate it properly for the overall benefit of our military forces who were fighting all over the world. And we had new ways of gathering intelligence. We had new electronic means. Radar was used to gather intelligence. We had aerial photography. We had all kinds of devices that were not in the ordinary James Bond intelligence of pre-war days. So the Congress understood from a lot of testimony from experienced military leaders that one of the greatest shortages and one of the greatest mistakes in the war was that we did not have coordinated intelligence. So when Congress wrote the language of this legislation for the CIA, and I printed this literally in the book so that anyone that wants to read it will see exactly what the law says. It said that the CIA is created to coordinate the intelligence of the rest of the government, and that was why it was created. With that as the primary duty of CIA, then the other little tasks and things that we're supposed to do come forward. Mm-hmm. And it's a better explanation. In fact, it is the only explanation when it is put that way. There was not a single word, for example, in the law that said that the CIA should collect intelligence. There wasn't a single word in the law that said the CIA should get involved in covert operations. And this is the same law that exists today, by the way. We haven't changed. But gradually things change, whether they're written into the law or not. But we're talking about the law of 1947, how it was written and what it meant. So that the people that first became members of this new CIA knew that their job was the coordination of intelligence. I have no doubt. The enormous move toward Cold War, anti-communism, and all that, all the buzzwords that we've lived on for the last 30 or 40 years, did not exist there, at least not strongly. It was coming over the horizon. While the National Security Act of 1947 was being written, primarily by men like the great lawyer Clark Clifford, close friend of President Truman's, and an enormously influential man in this period. While that was being done, Churchill had made his speech in Missouri about the Iron Curtain and the Cold War and those things. The country was beginning to move in that direction. The era, the strange McCarthy era, had not come, but it was inevitable. It was on the way. What to do with the nuclear weapons was underway at the time. For instance, our military had never had a weapon as dynamic as the atom bomb. And what is important about an atom bomb, as it is with a barrel of oil, is it has no real value until it's been delivered. Well, the organization most able to deliver the atom bomb was the Air Force. And immediately, war planners saw that to use atom bombs, we would have to have an enormous fleet of very large aircraft. And one of the first things they did was began to build a bigger and better B-29, which was the largest plane we had during the war, and finally even the B-36 and then the B-52 to carry the atom bomb. They needed an enormous plane to do that. It was a monster of a device in those days. Well, these things began to shape strategy. Then as they began to think about this, if atom bombs were going to be used as the primary weapon, how were you going to put a navy and an army into the battleground that atom bombs had devastated or could devastate, either way? Because the enemy didn't have it. See, the enemy then, it used to be interesting. If you went to a military school in the 40s, you could talk about an enemy. But we were a Department of Defense. We weren't supposed to be talking about a particular enemy. And gradually, enemy became synonymous with Russia. And if we had opposing forces in a combat situation, we'd have the blue forces and the red forces. And we always knew we were the blue ones and that the Soviet. Gradually, this thinking came about. So while we were predominant with the nuclear weapon, it almost was ridiculous to think of any country as equal opposite force to ours. And that furthermore underscored the enormous mistake made in calling this military the Department of Defense, because if ever we were strong on the offense, it was immediately after World War II. We weren't a defensive nation at that time, but we were made a defensive nation by the Department of Defense. I haven't heard many people discuss that in these so many words. I did in Yale when I was teaching. I used to talk about that a lot because I had hoped that that was not really what was going to be the end of all this planning. Well, as the CIA started late in 47, it was primarily a rollover of World War II trained military people. The head of it was an admiral, Admiral Hillenkoetter. Mm-hmm. And I think out of the number that they had, over 5,000 were directly serving military people. They weren't reservists or anything. They were active duty people. And gradually, people from OSS and new recruitment began to fill up the agency. But that took years. That got into the Dulles era, Allen Dulles era in the Eisenhower administration. During the late 40s, the number of civilians that rolled into the agency gradually was a relatively small number. I say relatively small with respect to, say, today. And among them, though, were some very strong OSS residual members who were well-trained in the side of covert work that involves clandestine operations. And despite the fact that that was totally overlooked in the law, even so much as to suppress that kind of activity by not putting it in the law and not creating a budget basis for that kind of expenditure of funds, the people with that training came into the CIA. Certainly the military wasn't going to get into that business, nor was the State Department. So it was a question of where do you keep this? So the residual OSS capability fell into the lap of the CIA. But even then, that took years. That didn't happen until General Walter Beetle Smith came home from Russia, where he had been ambassador to Russia, and became the director of Central Intelligence in, I believe, about 1950.
October of 1950.
And at that time, he brought Allen Dulles in as his deputy director of plans, which means in charge of covert operations. Well, Dulles had been with the OSS. And then he announced to the president that if he was going to be in charge, if he was going to be the director of Central Intelligence, he was going to have OPC under him and not scattered around with responsibilities in the State Department and the Defense Department. A lot has been said about OPC in the sense that how could such an organization have been created without law, and how was this ingenious little device of appointing its senior officer? The way it read was that he would be nominated by one secretary, either State or Defense, and having to be seconded by the other, and then would be approved, and as though he didn't have a single commander. Well, everybody knew that was temporary, and it had no real significance because the real things that OPC was doing was to preserve certain assets, certain highly classified assets of World War II. He was not initiating operations. Now, I don't mean to say that disregarding some of the very practical things that were being done. For instance, we had clandestine operations underway in Greece as a result of the Greek Civil War right after the World War II, and these spilled over into Bulgaria and nearby countries across the Greek border. We had other operations going on in China, but relatively speaking, they were small, and they were, again, residuals of World War II. They were not planned operations as against some communist nation or that kind of thing. They were there, but they existed, and this was there. And the chief of OPC at the time was Frank Wisner, who had been a very dominant OSS leader in Eastern Europe during World War II, and later who led this massive campaign against Indonesia in 1958. So Wisner was very active in the covert activities. But when General Smith became the DCI, he insisted upon bringing that group into the agency. Now, strictly speaking, that was not supported by law. It was sort of an expedient. One of the most important facets of this National Security Act of 1947 was the creation of the National Security Council. We had not had something like that in peacetime in other years, not under Roosevelt and not before, and I don't even recall anything like that in the World War I period. What was decided was that there are times when, for purposes of national security, there must be top-level decisions, and that the President needed assistance in making those decisions. So the National Security Council, by law, is the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense. No others. They can invite others, and others do attend the meetings, but there are no other statutory members. If we relate that to today's affairs, in all these questions about the Iran and Contra hearings and all those problems, there could not have been a decision about covert operations involving the Contras or Iran or exchange of hostages or any of that without a decision from the National Security Council. That's by law. There's no other way to do it other than an illegal way, and I don't think that's ever even been assumed that there had to be decisions from the National Security Council. From my own experience and background, I just cannot believe that the members of the National Security Council during this Iran-Contra period have removed themselves from the whole thing as though they had nothing to do with it. That's preposterous. By law, they had to. If they didn't do it, they were derelict in their duty, and they should be tried for that. That's what the National Security Council was created to do. And in the 40s, the National Security Council met and created a directive which I believe is called 10-2. And 10-2 recognized that the U.S. government might from time to time be involved or involve itself in covert action. Generally, this would mean relatively small activities, not major warfare like the Korean War or the Vietnam War, that kind of thing, not even like the invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. I believe these were truly clandestine covert actions, and there were many of them, many of them. Later on, when I got into this business in the 50s, we had things like that going all the time, but they were small. Now, the decision to involve the United States in covert action had to be made by this National Security Council. No one else. No one else had the authority. And you see, that means even that the DCI, the head of the intelligence agency, was not part of the National Security Council. Therefore, he was not involved in the decision. He would be told about the decision. Well, during the 40s and the early 50s, things worked that way. In 1948, a rather important thing happened. President Truman wanted to have a highly qualified group study how the CIA was moving along, how it was progressing, and whether or not it was becoming effective. So he established a committee headed by Allen Dulles, who was a New York lawyer with the most prominent and largest law firm in New York City, Sullivan Cromwell. A man named Matthias Correa, who I believe also was a lawyer, although I don't recall his career that closely. His name, Correa, C-O-R-R-E-A, Matthias Correa. And then a man named Jackson. Jackson had a lot of experience, OSS experience. I think Correa did, and I certainly know that Dulles did. But anyway, this committee of three men, primarily Allen Dulles, made an extensive study of the activities of the CIA, and in their report to the President, recommended a move more into the clandestine operations area and more into the traditional intelligence area than the law had even visualized. Well, a very interesting thing about this committee, it was appointed by President Truman in his final year as president, as a successor to Roosevelt. See, Roosevelt died in 45, and he was the vice president, so he hadn't won an election yet, and he was going to run for re-election late 48 and then a new term beginning in 49. His opponent was Thomas E. Dewey. And interestingly, Thomas Dewey's speechwriter during the 1948 campaign against Truman was Allen Dulles. So you see, Dulles was riding two horses across this stream. He was technically Truman's advisor with respect to intelligence matters, he and Jackson and Correa. At the same time, he's writing speeches for Thomas E. Dewey, strongly opposing the re-election of Truman. I don't know whether Truman knew he was writing speeches for Dewey or whether Dewey knew he was working for Truman. I mean, I have no way to solve that little problem. But it's pretty neat to understand the effect of that, and it helps you understand the mind of this man Dulles. Dulles see nothing wrong in that sort of thing, you see nothing wrong in working for Truman and trying to undercut him by helping Dewey or vice versa. Well, this had an influence on the report because, of course, Dulles, as was Jackson and Correa, were absolutely convinced, along with most of the country, that Dewey was going to be elected president. So as he wrote this report, he saw that report as, you might say, his own Mein Kampf. It was his own idea of what CIA was going to become, because he was positive that Dewey would make him the Director of Central Intelligence when Dewey became president. See, and that designed the report. Well, as we know, Truman turned around and beat Dewey in a great surprise, and without much ado, the Dulles, Jackson, and Correa report was slid under the White House door on the 1st of January 1949, and we never heard much of it after that. Although many of the things within the report did appear years later, because when Eisenhower became president, John Foster Dulles became Secretary of State, General Walter Beadle Smith became his deputy in the Secretary of State, stepped down from CIA, and Allen Dulles became the Director of Central Intelligence. Well, at that time, Dulles pulled out his own Dulles-Jackson-Correa report and began to put it in effect, and as you know, he remained the DCI for the next 11 years. Really, the signal primary character of the CIA is Mr. Dulles. There's no question about it. It's his agency, and nobody else has left any mark like his. But you need to see that background to understand what the passage of the National Security Act really meant in 1947, and what it says in law is what creates many of these controversies about intelligence today, because there still is no law that says that the CIA is an intelligence organization. It says it's a coordinating agent, and there's no law that says it is a covert operation agency. So that's a fairly good summary, as I've seen it through my own lifetime, of the law itself, the effect of the law, and then particularly how the CIA was an outgrowth of the law, and what the CIA was trying to do, and what the National Security Council was trying to do, and what the Congress was trying to do. And this eventually led to a remarkable statement by President Truman, I believe in December 1963, when he wrote as a columnist for a newspaper that the greatest mistake he made in his entire career as president was to sign the bill that created the Central Intelligence Agency.
Even though at the time it could be argued that he would not have seen the effect of his signing into law something which over time was changed by degree into something else.
Well, it's true that he never did sign the law that, I mean, the law he signed, if they had stayed within its parameters, the agency would have been much different. But he recognized that by setting this up, he initiated it.
I guess this perhaps is already explained by what you've just said, but perhaps just to comment briefly on this, you wrote on page 138 of The Secret Team that Congress had been so certain that the agency would not become operational and policy-making that it was content to place it under the control of a committee. Congress knew that the agency would never be permitted to become involved in clandestine operations, and therefore that the NSC would never have to direct it in an operational sense. How, at the time, do you feel Congress felt so unequivocal about this?
Well, you see, that's not a hard statement to understand in the time of the 1940s. It is today in the 80s or in the 70s or in the 60s. In the late 1940s, Congress and the congressmen who were, many of them, veterans of World War II, knew very well that the United States government was not going to have a covert operation, covert establishment running around the world, and they had not even created a new major intelligence organization. Congress, in other words, believed the words of the law that it had just written and passed. Furthermore, we weren't in the buzzword period or the Pavlovian period of anti-communism at that time. It was coming, but it didn't exist then. Yeah. And we were sitting on top of the atom bomb capability, which meant that we were the absolute power in the world. Things were so different in the late 40s that you can't take those statements without a lot of care and understanding and transpose them to either the 60s, the 70s, or 80s. It's just ridiculous. You have to read them in terms of the 40s. And that's a pretty true statement of the 40s. Mm-hmm. But, of course, you'd change it if you were writing it today. And I'm sure Congress' view of CIA today is nothing like that, you see. But that is an important commentary on what has changed. And what has changed really in the people's minds, but not really in the language of the law. The same law exists, but it's people's minds that have changed. It's our concept of the world that has changed. And that's a very important statement.
Mm-hmm. You do describe in fairly multitude of examples Allen Dulles' ability to, in effect, subvert the watchdog role of the NSC, which was intended to prevent such things as the CIA carrying out clandestine operations, by such moves as engineering the creation of such subcommittees as the Special Group 5412/2 that effectively neutralized such oversight functions as were intended to be carried out under the authority of the Operations Coordinating Board. Now, you've just mentioned how the OCB originally was set up to, in effect, have some supposed authority given to it by the Secretaries of Defense and State, and then how Walter Beadle Smith in late 1950, in a sense, regained that person's position as claiming it for himself, that person was directly under him. Can you explain somehow, particularly Dulles, who is so central to this, was able to redefine this watchdog role of the NSC over clandestine operations?
Okay, first of all, let me make a technical correction to your question. The OCB was the Operations Coordinating Board, which was a part of NSC by law. OCB was intended to be a group of senior individuals, or it was a group of senior individuals who would follow the decisions made by the National Security Council and make sure that the bureaucracy carried them out. That was the function of the OCB, a different organization. The Operations Policy, OPC, the Operations Policy Committee, was the residual OSS organization that was under Frank Wisner. and an extremely distinct organization from OCB.
Okay.
The OPC had been created only without law. See, it came from World War II. It was a necessary function. It was like sweeping up things left on the floor after the war. We had to keep alive the records from the OSS, and it was agreed to put this organization only structurally within the State Department, but to control its chief by making the new Secretary of Defense and his counterpart, the Secretary of State, responsible for the leader of the organization, giving him some control that way. The budgetary function was minimal. It was just a matter of paying people, that's about all, and taking care of the records. A lot of people have misinterpreted the OPC, although when it gradually worked its way into the CIA under Beadle Smith, it did become dominant. Again, it became rather strong, and it became the main clandestine operations sector of the agency, later known as the Deputy Director of Plans, and that sort of thing. So I like to correct the two. The two letters are somewhat similar, but the jobs are entirely different. Now we'll go back to Mr. Dulles and how he was able to circumvent the law. And really, the best way is to say again that the report that he had written with Correa and with Jackson outlined his vision of how the CIA ought to be. He believed that. He thought that it ought to have a full intelligence powers, including secret intelligence, and that it ought to have the clandestine capability to carry out any operations directed by the National Security Council. Well, by the time, see, he thought that could be started in '49. But by the time he got to be the DCI, things hadn't worked that way. The CIA had been kept rather quiet. It was coordinating intelligence, and it was doing very little in the covert activities field. He felt that should change, but he didn't have any law to do it. So what he did is he would take a plan that they had made up because of some input from a foreign country or from one of his station chiefs around the world that was in response to some action. Well, then he'd go to the National Security Council. They didn't direct him to go to X country and do something. They were approving something that he felt he ought to do in response to an action that some of his operators, some of his agents had seen in a foreign country. And that device enabled him to create activities as though they were reaction, and most of the time they were, or responses. And so the NSC found itself not directing covert operations, but approving reactive covert operations. There's quite a bit of difference. But when you're doing that with an organization like the CIA, under an ambitious leader like Allen Dulles, it's pretty hard to tell the difference, because sometimes you can create a response by kicking somebody under the table and they pound you in the nose, then you point to your partner and say, look at that guy, just hit me. You didn't know you kicked him under the table. The best example, the absolute best example I know of that tactic was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese that came out in the vicinity of the destroyers, which the Navy now admits were never even hit by anything fired at them, probably not even fired at. But the why those North Vietnamese Comar ships, very high-speed ships, came out there was because they had been hit clandestinely. So that the first act was by our own forces, aided with South Vietnamese. Then when the North Vietnamese came out, they had been provoked. It wasn't, they did not initiate the attack. But in the discussion of that, both by President Johnson and in Congress, when they were discussing the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, they were only told that the attack had been made by the North Vietnamese upon our Navy without provocation. So you can control covert activities by using that same device to kick under the table, and then you can say, hey, now look what happened in the Congo, or look what happened in Indonesia, or look what happened in Tibet. We've got to do something about it. This was the technique that Dulles was the master of working at, and he tried to have the agency ready to be responsive anywhere in the world. And of course he had to do it that way because there were no plans. They didn't sit here and say, well, here's what we see happening in such and such a country, and here's what we think ought to be done, and here's how the United States should get in there with a covert operation to perform this or that. There was none of that. There was no planning shop. In fact, I've always thought, and I worked very closely with them, that one of the strangest devices they used was to call their covert operations the deputy director plans, because there were no plans. I worked with them intimately for 9 years. I never saw a single plan come out of the deputy director plans. And of course they would simply smile and say, well, that's just our euphemism for covert operations. But it was they could have used some other word than plan, because that was. But this is how Dulles worked, you see, and he was very effective. And he had a lot of experience with OSS. And the other side of it is that his brother was the Secretary of State and the dominant vote in the National Security Council. I don't think this would have been the same if he had been an individual with, say, some either neutral or objective Secretary of State. It made quite a bit of difference under the Eisenhower era to have the two Dulles working together in the development of covert operations.
Mm-hmm. And therefore then this key revising of the word as specified in the law that the NSC would direct the CIA, and now that the agency was in effect to turn this into the NSC approving measures brought to it by the CIA.
Precisely. See, I remember one example out of 9 years' work when I knew that the NSC had directed the CIA to involve itself in something, and that was Tibet. When the Chinese communists started overrunning Tibet, it was the NSC that put the CIA into that operation. And I must confess that in all those years, 55 to 64, pretty active years, I never saw another one come by direction. They were all responsive and reactive operations to things where Mr. Dulles or people that followed him would go in to brief the NSC from their own papers and say, here's what's been happening in country A, we propose an operation to oppose that. That's why we got into what was called counterinsurgency. We countered the insurgency. Yeah. Almost everything we were doing was a reactive response, but that was the Dulles method. That was his characteristic.
I'd like to quote a part here regarding the intelligence community as a whole. You wrote that on page 141 of the Secret Team, over the years it has become customary to speak of the various intelligence organizations within the government as members of the community. This word is quite proper because there is little cohesion and homogeneity within this vast infrastructure which has cost so much and which performs so many varied and separate functions. The members of the community are the CIA, the Army, Navy, and Air Force as separate divisions, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the FBI, the Atomic Energy Commission, the State Department, and the National Security Agency. All are by law brought together by the Director of Central Intelligence, or DCI. His title is not the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, although he does head that agency for the purpose of advising the NSC in matters concerning such intelligence activities of the government departments and agencies as relate to national security. That's directly from the National Security Act of 1947. This is the DCI's first duty as prescribed by law. He is to advise the NSC of the activities of the other departments and agencies. Could you discuss the importance of the fact that all of the above listed members of the intelligence community, quote, are by law brought together by the Director of Central Intelligence, unquote, and the implications of such an all-encompassing position?
That's a good section to bring out for discussion, because the law didn't establish means something else in government. The law created the CIA to coordinate intelligence of the other branch of the government, as I listed them there. And the law specifically deals with the function of the Director of Central Intelligence. He is different from his organization. He is the Director of Intelligence over the other intelligence organizations within the scope of the law that established him. He's not their boss in a sense that the Navy intelligence operates for the CNO, for the Chief of the Navy. But as far as intelligence matters are concerned, and as far as coordinating intelligence matters, he's the director for the coordinating purposes. It's quite a clear distinction, but you can see it does get waffled around. And certain of the intelligence assets of various departments, we'll say the Navy, are very independent. Navy's intelligence organization goes way back to Revolutionary War days. They are an excellent professional organization, and they're worldwide, and they're very powerful and very able. They were not subverting themselves to any new boss. They knew their job, and they made that clear when the law was being written. In fact, they protested the law more than anybody else. The Army has its own black intelligence, very deep intelligence, in many ways deeper than the CIA has ever learned how to do. They were not going to fold that into the CIA either. The Air Force was brand new, excuse me, had no intelligence other than experience as part of the Army. However, the Air Force had the aircraft, the U-2, the SR-71, the bombers and the camera plane, all the reconnaissance planes. They had the methods of intelligence that they could use that the DCI needed for coordinating also. So the Air Force, although it was new, in some ways was probably more important than the other branches. So you see, what I'm saying is that this intelligence community, which the law was created to bring together, was not homogeneous, but they were essential to each other. No more than, say, the National Security Agency. Just think what any of these would be without the National Security Agency. They all depend upon the National Security Agency for the intercept of electronic transmission and all the other communications intelligence and all the rest. Well, the National Security Agency is a function of the Department of Defense. In fact, the office where I used to be assigned was responsible for directing the National Security Agency in order that we could coordinate it with state and CIA and the others ourselves to make sure it was effective. A very nice way to do this thing, and it was important in those days. So there is an intelligence community of great importance and great significance to each one of its components. But the sole chief of that community by law is the Director of Central Intelligence in the role that he's coordinating. No more than that. He doesn't direct these people in a clandestine exercise, not at all. Then he's the Director of Central, then he is the head of the CIA, and then he carries out things that are assigned to the CIA. So, I'm sorry, it's quite clear how that works, although I'm afraid historically there are many, many abuses and a lot of times oversights in that, primarily because many of these agencies and departments have very parochial interests of their own, and it's pretty hard for anybody to coordinate them.
In the law for powers and duties under National Security Act, Section 3, it says to correlate and evaluate intelligence relating to the national security. What about just going through very briefly, examining or discussing the stated or explicit role of each of these members, as well as any important unstated roles that they carry out today? Let's start out with the CIA, at least in terms of the way it should work, which may vary a lot from the way it does.
You know, that's an excellent way to put the question, because it's impossible to answer that. You see, as we've been talking about, the law was written in 46 and 47 at an era that we cannot duplicate today at all. So I would just say right off that it would be futile to try to enforce the law literally on either the Defense Department or the CIA. There's no way you could, or the State Department. However, you have to abide by the law, see? So you, at that point, you begin to let, you might say, the law of custom step in. What have we been doing? What have we accepted? So today, I don't think you could ever press back into the bottle what was decided in 46 and 47 and say that's what the CIA is going to do. There's just no way you could do that. And I don't know how to prescribe for the CIA what it ought to be doing today by thinking about the law. But there's one part of the law that can take care of this, and this was one of the really beautiful things about that law, and that is that no matter what the CIA wants to do or tries to do or is funded to do, a very important statement of that, funded to do, because Congress permits the CIA to do an awful lot by pouring money into the CIA. If you got money, you're going to spend it. You know, Parkinson's law. If you build an office and you put a man in the office, he's going to go to work whether you tell him or not. So you fund the CIA and you're going to get things done. Well, in the present time, under that situation, this emphasizes the great significance of the National Security Council.
Okay.
Now, this, what we've been talking about, emphasizes the very great importance of the National Security Council. If the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense can't handle the CIA, nobody can. Mm-hmm. And if they permit the funding from Congress or any other really covert work to put CIA into areas that they didn't approve, it's their fault. Nobody else's. This is one of the serious things about this recent Iran thing, that it seems as though Congress wants to accept the fact that Poindexter, McFarlane, North, and all those men were doing things that the NSC didn't approve. And they are legitimizing that, which is terrible. You know, really, for the future, is a terrible thing to put up with. We've got a law that says if you're going to get into clandestine operations, it can only be done at the direction of the National Security Council. Yeah. And here we have the men who were members of the National Security Council, Reagan, Bush, Weinberger, and Schultz, all walking off and saying we had nothing to do with it. Now that, for the next era, is an enormous problem. And if Congress doesn't recognize what's happening, they better do it pretty soon, because they're going to find covert things going on that nobody knows anything about. Because what they are doing then is regularizing what I said in my book, that there exists a secret team that's out of control. Mm-hmm. And now they have regularized that, you see. That's the danger. If they don't keep the National Security Council over these organizations, they'll never get the genie back in the bottle.
Which is so curious, since you heard such a hue and cry during the hearings in the summer of '87 regarding that they're trying to take too much power away from the executive. There needs to be, the president needs to have more power here in these operations. When in fact he already had the power with the NSC.
And he denies he used it. See, the president's had nothing to do with what those fellows were doing. Mr. Bush even today is saying, I didn't do anything down in Honduras, or I didn't do anything when I met with the Israelis, or the, you know. It's appalling, because if they're going to accept that, they're denying the role of the National Security Council, and then they're permitting almost anybody else in the government to run covert operations. Yeah. Now, that's something else people need to understand about covert operations. We talk about the CIA being in charge of covert operations. Almost any branch of the government gets into covert operations, and they do it in a team fashion. That's why I called it the secret team, because I saw just as many people working in covert operations in Customs Service, in the Treasury Service, even in FAA sometimes, as I did when we saw CIA people and defense people working. It just depends on what type of operation you're in or who wants it done. Mm-hmm. It's not the CIA all the time, although they all get together and say it was the CIA. The CIA might have just had a representative in there. Or the CIA would provide its special communications and its other facilities that they have. As we heard in the case of Ollie North and the others, they had these special communications devices and all that. But other people were doing the jobs, you see. So we have to learn a lot more about how these things are done. But if we deny the role of the National Security Council, we're going to be in very, very deep trouble. There'll be no one in charge at all. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A very central point, it seems, in the Secret Team book was your qualifying people who were working either within the military or then in a position, say, inside the Central Intelligence Agency. Could you please, regarding this term military, clarify the use throughout this book of the 4 examples of different types of military personnel you define?
Well, now, in ordinary agency business, there's a need for close relationship between the agency and the military departments. So hundreds of experienced intelligence officers are assigned to work with the CIA. The distinction is they're paid by their service. They are under the control of their service commanders. But they sit in a CIA office and work with the CIA for the purpose of coordinating intelligence. They bring to the CIA certain assets that it doesn't have, and the CIA exposes to them certain assets, so they work together. That's one thing. The next thing, there are certain military officers that the CIA needs to have for its own purposes. Let's say pilots, all right, as one career field, helicopter pilots or aircraft pilots, so on. So the CIA will pay the Department of Defense for, say, 100 pilots who will be assigned to CIA. The CIA reimburses the Department of Defense for those men, and strictly speaking, they work as employees of the CIA. The Defense Department, if it wishes, could hire 100 more pilots within its limits, you see, because it has this money from the CIA. Now, in every case of that, by the way, the man who is assigned is a volunteer. He doesn't have to go. He's not being assigned by the military. He's accepting an offer from the CIA. What we do is we keep dual records because we don't want to penalize either his military service or his retirement benefits and all that. He's still a government employee. This is a very technical area we start getting into there, but that's a second use. You see, they take these people over there as they do people from agriculture or as they do from FAA. They need certain other assets which they pay for. Then we have an extensive group of people in the reserve. They can be called to active duty. They can be employed as civilians by CIA and then, with the permission of the Defense Department, called to active duty. And, of course, they're paid for by the CIA. They work for the CIA. They're CIA employees. But only in certain jobs are they permitted, by agreement with the Defense Department, to put on their uniforms, carry defense ID, and work, maybe in a friendly country or maybe in a marginal country. Like we have organizations in Athens, in Australia, in many countries around the world where military officers are assigned, but the CIA is using their capability. So there's a third group. And I think if we would go another step further, there are certain, this is a pretty rare case, but it existed, certain CIA men who have to be assigned to certain countries for specific duties, but there's no way the CIA can tell that country, look, I'm sending you a CIA agent. They sometimes say this is a man is with the State Department, Foreign Service officer, but very frequently would say this man is a military officer. And with the approval, with the cognizance of the Defense Department, they take just Mr. X and call him Commander Jones. And he's made him a Navy commander and everything, and ostensibly he's a Navy commander. And he never been on the military rolls before, but he works for CIA. So you can have those 4 different roles simultaneously, and they exist in large numbers, thousands. During my day, I think we had over 5,000 people in these various categories, and they're effective around the world. In fact, I can remember a meeting when President Diem in Saigon said, I have a real problem here. I have all these generals who are military generals, but I find out they're really CIA. How do I know who's CIA? And of course, in his country, there were more CIA generals than there were military generals. So he had a right to the question. Well, the same has happened in other countries, but usually it's kept pretty quiet, and the people are there for specific jobs. There are not generally abuses of the situation. We know what's going on, and at least in the days when I was intimate with this situation, we were kept very well informed in the Defense Department about these. We knew these agreements existed, and the people were taken care of very carefully, and we kept it on the books under the regulatory base of reimbursement. We made them pay us money for these people when they were our military people.
Stepping back for a minute to this idea of the shift in government policy after World War II from offense to defense. You spoke on page 126 to 127 about this in terms of the positive action that war, the idea of war, had held in the past. Quoting from the book here, you write, "What began perhaps as an honest effort to alert this country to the fact that the Soviet government did in fact have the potential to unleash the secrets of the atom, and thus to build atomic bombs, gradually became a powerful tool in the hands of the irresponsible and the agitators. The first great fault with the drift of opinion at that time became evident in the very shift of emphasis with regard to the national military establishment. Throughout our history, the idea of war had been treated as a positive action. War was the last resort of a nation, after all means of diplomacy had failed, to impress its might and its will upon another. And throughout our proud history, we never had faced war as something passive or reactive. But somehow in that post-war era, this nation began to think of war as defense alone. In other words, in this defense philosophy, we were not telling the world that the most powerful nation in the world was showing its magnanimity and restraint. We were saying that we would defend only, and to the rest of the world that meant we were going to play a passive role in world affairs, and that we were passing the active role, and with it the initiative, to others, in this case to the men in the Kremlin. We not only said this as we disestablished our traditional War Department, but we have done it throughout the intervening 25 years by developing the capability to search out the action of an enemy and then by responding. This defensive posture of our military and foreign policy has been a terrible mistake, and it opened the doors for the newborn intelligence community to move in and take over the control of U.S. foreign and military policy. Just briefly, could you discuss the idea stated above that throughout our history the idea of war has been a positive action?
I think that, that's a powerful concept, and we have to talk about that. To have the greatest and most powerful nation on earth, and in the 40s when we dominated power because we were the only ones with the atom bomb and the only ones with the means to deliver the atom bomb effectively all over the world, we all of a sudden went into this guise of defense when we talked about our military. A clear example of it, during the Vietnam War, General Westmoreland's goals were search and destroy.
Right.
Search, you're looking for something, and if you find it, you destroy it. It isn't destroy, it isn't attack. He wasn't on the offense. He was looking for something to shoot at, to destroy as a defensive mechanism. It affected even what I would call small wars that way. We were on the defense. He had no objective in Vietnam. He had no place to go in Vietnam and win the war. I've said in earlier elements of this discussion with you that the first officer I reported to the first day of my military duty, sometime in July 1941, happened to be a captain named Creighton W. Abrams, who became Chief of Staff of the Army and head of our forces in Vietnam after Westmoreland. I know from friends of mine, I've known General Abrams all my life. He's from my hometown. And I know from friends of mine who were with him that when President Johnson told him that he was going to be the commander in Vietnam, that he rather casually turned to the president had said, Johnson, with his gung-ho attitude, said, "Now, Abe, you've got 550,000 men in the Army out there. All you need to do the job. You've got the strongest Navy assembled in the world, the 7th Fleet, and you've got an Air Force that has delivered more bombs than in all of World War II. Now, by God, Abe, go out and do it." And I've been told that Abrams or one of his immediate staff turned to the president and said, "Mr. President, would you want to define the word it for us? What is it that if we do it, will win that war from your position as our commander-in-chief?" The president put his arm around Abrams' shoulder and led him to the door and sent him to Saigon. There was no it in the Vietnam War. That was the problem. When General Krulak, the very able Marine commander, became chief of all Marines in the Pacific, he devised a war plan that would move the forces forward strongly fortified with native forces, people that were imbued with the idea of fighting for their country, to march on Hanoi and take over that and end the war. He could not get approval for that plan from the president and from Averell Harriman, who at that time was serving as the assistant Secretary of State for Far East Affairs. In other words, all the military agreed. The Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mr. McNamara, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, CINCPAC, Admiral Sharp, all the military agreed with his plan. They knew it was the way to do it. But Averell Harriman, a civilian, and President Johnson, a civilian, imbued with the idea of we're on the defense, couldn't see that, and they denied General Krulak the permission or the direction to go and do it, just what President Johnson wanted them to do. Well, that's making an example out of the statements, but you see, that's what happens. Warfare, probably best defined by Clausewitz, is an all-out action of a certain country. It is total action. It's not halfway, it's not divided, it's not graduated, it's total. Well, you can't make total defense. You have to make total offense, even if you're in a defensive position. If you're in a siege in a fort, you'd be thinking about offense because you're thinking of getting out of there. You're going to die if you stay there, you see. Offense is the core of war. Clausewitz lists 9 principles of war that have been the same ever since men were throwing stones at each other, on up to atom bombs. The primary principle of war is the objective. If you don't know what you're doing, you got no business going to war. That is the antithesis of the idea of having a Department of Defense. And this is very important for our country. We don't know why we have a military. In fact, when President Reagan spoke about having weapons in space, he called it the Strategic Defense Initiative, putting 2 opposite words together, the initiative and the defense. Defense initiative. The words don't even go together. You know, it's like having a cat dog or something, you know. You can't do it. Well, this is how bad the thinking about warfare has become in this country. And it isn't because people have become less able. It's because they are unable to assimilate the power and the threat of nuclear weapons. And today, the power and the threat of the biological weapons, such as AIDS. AIDS is a weapon, and don't forget it. It was developed by the Defense Department, and it's a weapon. And people need to know that, and they should never forget it. It is a biological weapon created by the Defense Department, funded by Congress. That's all a matter of record. It is not a disease that came out of some cellar somewhere by mistake. So, and this is why people don't know how to assimilate the idea of warfare. They don't know what to do with hydrogen bombs that can erase a whole city in seconds. And they don't know what to do with AIDS as a weapon. It gets away and they can't stop it. Well, that's the basic problem we're having today when we talk about warfare. We have forgotten how war is waged. And defense is not the way to wage a war.
How would you see an offensive, positive, action-based War Department operate in the world today?
Because of the power of weapons, including some that we only talk about and haven't used yet, there is no way to wage war. Man is too puny a beast to cope with hydrogen bombs. There's no way you can do it. You can destroy the earth, but that's not winning a war. So when you ask me to define that, we can still fight. We can still make victory. We can still go on the offense. But we will do it economically. Yeah. And we are doing it economically. The first battle of the new kind of war was called the Arab oil embargo. We made the entire world pay tribute to the people who possess petroleum. And it's quite a battle. And it separates the winners and the losers, but that's the new battle. The second battle is being prepared, and it will be the battle over food. And this blends in with the idea that increasingly we hear of Malthusianism. We are beginning to agree or to permit the concept of genocide because of too many people on Earth. Well, that fits in with this next battle that's coming up. Petroleum, in a sense, is a luxury. You can walk to work. You don't have to drive to work. But when the battle becomes the battle for food, there's no alternative. You have to have food. And this is, war still is on. See, people's minds are still, we're ready to fight. Terrorism is a function of this, but terrorism is not war. Terrorism is mosquitoes, and you kill mosquitoes if you can. But food becomes a weapon of war, and there's no way we can have a war anymore. War is done when you're talking about divisions, battleships, bombers, because of hydrogen bombs.
Right. Would there be any way through the thicket, with the benefit of hindsight, that you would see possible such a form of a department of government having been retained and maintained in the years immediately after World War II, with all the accompanying pressures and transformations of that time? I suppose the answer would be no, because of the nuclear capabilities.
Yeah. That you see, the leading commanders immediately after Hiroshima had no trouble in seeing that if you replicated that around the world, you'd just do it until the world was ashes. Well, when the Russians perfected the hydrogen bomb, and remember, the Russians initiated the hydrogen bomb, perfected it first. We did it second. We could immediately, we knew they had exploded a weapon, a device, equal to about 50 megatons. And that device is so powerful that it not only destroys an enormous part of Earth and puts radiation over a larger part, lethal radiation, but it actually blows a hole through the atmosphere above the Earth and goes on out into space somewhere. It's beyond control on Earth entirely. Well, our leaders recognized that as far back as 40s and early 50s. And you can see that ever since then, our presidents, including Eisenhower, could not visualize or even see the business of going to war anymore. The Korean War was just kind of a war game. When MacArthur really began to move, they called him back. The Vietnam War was even worse than that. There were no attacks, no moves anywhere. Anloa Valley, a very hostile area in the heart of the Vietnam, was captured 8 times by our forces. And once they captured it, they had no reason to keep it, so they walked away. And then it got hostile again, we captured it. That's the way war is being fought. And war now is outmoded entirely. Okay. I don't think many people are ready to accept that. But if I were teaching evolution of warfare today at Yale University, I would put the closing chapter on war, and I would simply end with the explosion of the hydrogen bomb. And just say, there it is.
That's it.
Doesn't mean you can't fight and shoot people.
Right.
You know, we've got automatic rifles on the streets now. I mean, I'm not saying people aren't going to be killed, but we are not going to have a war between country A and country B effectively anymore if hydrogen weapons are involved. Iraq and Iran can fight to exhaustion. Notice they didn't go anywhere. They fought each other for, 6 or 7 years and didn't go anywhere, didn't do anything except kill each other. If either one had a nuclear weapon, they'd have had to end the war mutually because they couldn't live with them. You know, they ended it in their countries.
Yeah. Discuss the significance of, as you write, quote, the schism between those who believed in the traditional school of national planning and overt diplomacy and those who believed in a passive role of reaction to a general enemy, or communism, unquote, that began after World War II, and how, quote, this latter school would operate in response to intelligence inputs without plans and without national objectives, would hide everything in secrecy, and would justify its actions in all instances as being anti-communist.
We've been talking a bit about that. That's very important. It used to be very interesting in the period of the 50s to go to SHAPE headquarters in Europe, the head of the NATO forces, and to work with the war plans people there. I was in the plans division of Air Force, and although I was doing the clandestine work, I was immersed in the plans work day after day for years. And I would go to the war plan sections in NATO, and you could see that there was no war plan that called for a war like World War II. What I mean by that is an all-out war where you take a general like General Patton and say destroy the German forces, bring the country to its knees, which he could do. In a modern war plan, if you wanted to destroy, we'll say, East Germany, you'd put You'd just push a few buttons and some rockets would fly over there and the nuclear weapons would fall, and you say, what's next? You know, that's the facts. So it was interesting to see in this transition period of the 50s when some people began to realize that's where the position we were in, and warplane had no place to go. And then over here, the people who were the officers that I described earlier working for the CIA, who were saying, yes, but we need to fight communism, and we can go in there and stop this insurgency, so we'll run a counterinsurgency program. And you know, it was the CIA that took the special forces who were designed to do post-strike work in a nuclear war and gradually moved special forces over into the civic action counterinsurgency side of the business. And they realized that if there was going to be any activity, they could promote that activity their way. You know, counterinsurgency type or covert operations, covered in secrecy and all that. But that's far removed from warfare. But it is a very lethal activity, going all the way up to the Vietnam War. It can once you start a fire going, no telling how far it's going to burn. You just keep throwing more fuel on a flame and it'll burn.
There's a very philosophical edge at one point. You're discussing the manifestation of the Manichaean devil. Is that the correct way to pronounce that?
I believe it
Manichaean
is, yes.
devil in the nuclear age. This is from page 226 and 27. Quoting, those who believed that our only road to salvation lay in greater stockpiling of atomic bombs, those who argued that it must be the hydrogen bomb, and those few who said that it must be both, all perhaps without common intent, began to create the idea of the enemy threat. It was coming. It was inevitable. The things that have been done since that period in the name of anti-enemy would make a list that in dollars alone would have paid for all the costs of civilization up to that time with money to spare. Such an enemy is not unknown. Man has feared this type of enemy before. It is human, and more than that, it is a social trait to dread the unknown enemy. This enemy is defined in one context as the Manichaean devil. Norbert Wiener says, quote, the Manichaean devil is an opponent, like any other opponent, who is determined on victory and will use any trick of craftiness or dissimulation to obtain this victory. In particular, he will keep his policy of confusion secret, and if we show any signs of beginning to discover his policy, he will change it in order to keep us in the dark, unquote. The great truth about this type of enemy is that he is stronger when he is imagined and feared than when he is real. One of man's greatest sources of fear is lack of information. To live effectively, one must have adequate information. It was in this great conflict that the National Security Act of 1947 was brewed, and man's demand for information pervaded and surmounted almost every other move he made. Thus a great machine was created. All of the resources of this country were poured into a single Department of Defense, defense against the great Manichaean devil which was looming up over the steppes of Russia, with the formula of the atomic bomb in the one hand and the policy of world communism in the other. Our statesmen foresaw the Russian detonation of the atomic bomb in 1949 and the concurrent acceleration towards the hydrogen bomb as soon thereafter as possible. So they created the Atomic Energy Commission in January of 1947 and then the Defense Department in September of 1947 and gave both of them the eyes and ears of the CIA to provide the essential information that at that time was really the paramount and highest priority. The AEC was ordered to achieve both goals, the second-to-none atomic bomb stockpile and the hydrogen bomb, and the DoD was ordered to create the global force that would defend this country against the giant of the Soviet Union and all other nuclear powers. Discuss the significance of, quote, the transfer in January 1947 of the great nuclear weapon technology to the Atomic Energy Commission.
Well, we'll start with that final question because it's an important one. The atom bomb, as you know, was developed under the Manhattan Project, which was part of the Army during the war. It was obvious that at the end of the war, there would have to be a continuing development with atomic weapons, fission weapons, that there would also probably be peacetime use of these weapons, that the ability to manufacture these rare materials, plutonium and the like, for the weapons was an enormous facility and would have to be run by someone. And yet, it was inadvisable to keep that in the Army. It was felt this should be under national control, more or less like for coordination, almost like the CIA to coordinate all this. So they moved this business of the nuclear weapons into the Atomic Committee, AEC.
Energy Commission.
Yeah, and they continued the development of the fission weapon, which is, at the time they were dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were two different types and more or less competing with each other for perfection. So there was a lot of research still to do, and finally they got the atom bomb from a monster that you could put one in a B-29 down to where you could carry it around the back of a Volkswagen. You know, they improved it and enlarged it also. And in due time created the hydrogen bomb, which now can be any size you want. You can make a hydrogen bomb that's about big as you want. So this was put under the Atomic Energy Commission, as well as the development of nuclear power and to a degree space materials and so on. That was a practical matter. The other side of this thing, the Manichaean devil, is just another way of talking about the Cold War.
Yeah.
You can't get Congress to appropriate money for an enormous war organization unless you can show a reason for it. Huh. And so we had to create the reason. We had to create this devil, and we created communism. Even the Soviets don't understand the communism we think about. It goes so far beyond. And we saw it in every closet, every country. We divided the entire world up into us and them. So then we began to create a military establishment that could counter, we thought, every move made by anybody. Every time India went a little bit pro-communist, India became our enemy. Every time India went a little bit toward us, then they became our friends. Well, everybody was in that area. They were there were no neutrals. It was all us and them. Well, this has resulted in the expenditure of $6 trillion for armaments, most of which can never be used effectively. There is no way to use them effectively. Even in Vietnam, we dumped 2.5 times as much bombardment onto the ground in Vietnam as we did in all of World War II. To what effect? We killed a lot of people, we uprooted a lot of trees, and so on, but there was no really military effect of that. Well, that's the way the rest of our establishment is. They could have been hydrogen bombs. In fact, you know, we had nuclear weapons in Indochina. Fortunately, we didn't use them, but they were there. So, but on the other side of it, if you create this devil, and he's in every closet around the world, then you can justify having a 600 fleet navy and a something or other wing air force and an enormous army, because you keep telling the Congress and the American people that, my goodness, this great enormous devil is going to leap out of a closet any day at any time. The war could start here or it could start there, and we've got to be ready for the whole world. And that's how you spend the money. Even though you can't prove what you're going to do with the money, you spend it. You see, the devil scares you so bad that you don't think anymore. You just, even the Strategic Defense Initiative, this thing that was going to cost billions and billions, now we spend for a B-2 bomber, which is supposed to be stealthy. And they claim that radar cannot find that bomber as it approaches. Heck, it makes more noise than almost anything you ever heard. It's got huge engines, and they're ducted out so that even the radar can't read the engine, but that doesn't mean it shuts the sound down. The first way we used to detect bombers coming during World War II was with noise devices. So they'd just go back to noise devices. Stealth bomber will be worthless. It's already worthless before it flies. And the most expensive airplane spent $65 billion on an airplane that can't get in the air yet. And when it does, all the enemy, you say, will have to do is, instead of use radar, use audio, listen for it, and they know it's there. So we don't even know what we're doing. So that's what this Manichaean devil does. And an interesting little side, listen for it, and they know it's there. So we don't even know what we're doing. So that's what this Manichaean devil does. And an interesting little sideline about Vietnam. The Vietnam escalation modestly began in the Kennedy era. and Kennedy was said to have around him the Irish Mafia. If you know much about the lore of old Ireland, you'll know that the Irish mother would tell her bothersome child, if you aren't a good boy, the Kong will get you. The Kong will get you. The Kong was a ghost in the closet, see? Well, in Vietnam, the word for a beggar is a Kha, K-H-A. And they were briefing about these beggars, these troublemakers in Vietnam, and they were calling them the Viet Cong. Well, Kennedy's young Irish Mafia men who did not know much about Vietnam thought they were talking about the Viet Cong, the devil in the closet. And the word Viet Cong was created by mistake, by hearing the word Ka as a Vietnamese word, and Kong as the Irish ghost, and it just happened that in that era, we all of a sudden got Viet Cong out of the misapplication of the word right in an office in the Pentagon of Washington, and not out in the field in Vietnam. Ever after that, it was the Viet Cong. Well, that's how we create our Manichaean devils. That's how we create our opposition. That's how we spend $6 trillion.
You write further on concerning the realization of the Dulles-Jackson Correa's report's method of placing CIA agents throughout the government, quote, many of these people who have reached positions of great responsibility, I believe that the most powerful and certainly the most useful agent the CIA has ever had operates in just such a capacity within another branch of the government, and he has been there for so long that few have any idea that he is a long-term career agent of the CIA. Through his most excellent and skillful services, more CIA operations have been enabled to take place than can be laid at the feet of the agency, at the feet of any other, more legitimate agent. This was the plan and the wisdom of the Dulles idea from the beginning. On the basis of security, he would place people in all areas of the government, and then he would move them up and deeper into their cover jobs, until they began to take a very active part in the role of their own organizations. This is how the ST was born, the secret team. Today, the role of the CIA is performed by an ad hoc organization that is much greater in size, strength, and resources than the CIA has ever been visualized to be. So the first question I have here would be, how, quote, on the basis of security, unquote, would Allen Dulles, quote, place people in all other areas of the government?
Well, one of the first things that I realized was that it was Mr. Dulles' desire to have the office that General White asked me to create in the Air Force headquarters in order to create a focal point system. And as Mr. Dulles told me later, he said, I don't want various people from my agency going into the Pentagon and dealing with different people there, and therefore uncovering the activities of the CIA to a large number of people, because obviously such a ring would then proliferate to others, and if they wanted submarines, they'd have to bring in some Navy people, and if they wanted helicopters, they'd have to talk to some Army people. He said, I want a focal point. I want an office that's cleared to do what we have to have done, an office that knows us very, very well, and then an office has access to a system in the Pentagon, but the system will not be aware of what initiated the request. They'll think it came from the Secretary of Defense. They won't realize it came from the Director of Central Intelligence. So you see, the Dulles philosophy was to control the focal point area. This led then to the creation of focal point offices everywhere. And as I established this Tab 6 organization, we called it, in every major staff area within the Air Force, because that was my jurisdiction at the time, I would have cleared people, another focal point, you might say a sub-focal point, a person I could go to who had been given ahead of time the authority to do whatever it was that he was authorized to do. And we stressed that authorized business. He would have to be sure he had orders either from my office or directly up to the Chief of Staff, and that we knew what we were doing for CIA. Well, this leads to another step you might call breeding. we had to work with various agencies of the government, not just the Defense Department. We had to have contact points in the State Department, in the FAA, in the Customs Service, in the Treasury, in the FBI, and all around through the government, up in the White House. And gradually we wove a network of people who understood the symbols and the code names and the things we were doing and how we handled money, which was the most important thing. And then we began to assign people there who those agencies thought were from the Defense Department, but they actually were people that we put there from the CIA. This led to the creation of a system of powerful individuals, people whose jobs were quite dominant in some of these other agencies, especially after they'd been there 2 or 3 years, because we put them in there by talking to the top man, the cabinet officer or the head of the agency, and we'd say, this man is being placed here so that he can facilitate covert activities and so that he can retain the secrecy that's required, and he will keep you informed at all time. Well, in the bureaucracy, the top people move faster than anybody else, not the bottom people. And so the man we had explained that to maybe a year and a half earlier would be transferred or leave the government, but our man is still there. So 1 or 2 cycles of that, and that agency might not even know that guy was there anymore. They would, and I mean, what his origins were, they would think he was just another one of their own employees. And as a result, he became extremely effective, because if we wanted something done, I remember a rather very sensitive operation that I needed some information on, and I needed it from the FBI. I didn't go to the FBI. I went to this guy that we had planted, and he got it twice as fast and in a much better form than I would have gotten from the FBI, even though I was at that time working from the Office of Secretary of Defense. We had no trouble working with the FBI. It was just to facilitate it. Yeah. These people became very, very adept. By the same token, people that were employees of CIA agents were assigned, even in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. We had certain people there who were CIA employees. Ed Lansdale worked for CIA all his adult career. A person named Frank Hand worked there. Now, the people in the Pentagon thought they were ordinary military employees. They didn't realize, well, just to give you an example, Colonel Lansdale was a full colonel in the Air Force. That was his cover story. And he had been a full colonel for a few years. And the Air Force was promoting some men to general. The question came up, would Lansdale be eligible? And I told Mr. Dulles personally, I said, you can make Lansdale a general if you just write a letter to General LeMay, because you're going to pay the bills anyway, and not the Air Force. A few days later, I got a call from General LeMay's office. He called me in, and he had the list of men that the Air Force was promoting to general. And as I recall, it was only 13 or 14 officers, and LeMay, being General LeMay, knew every one of them except one. I don't know who the hell he is. I'm not going to promote him to a general. And I said, well, don't you have a file on him? He said, yes. He opened it up, and the top letter was from Allen Dulles. I said, he's a very important man for Allen Dulles. It's okay, I'll promote him. Just like that. Well, that's a good way to get a promotion, you see. But that created a very important job within the structure of the Office of Secretary of Defense. Frank Hand had been there for years in the same way. Frank was a civilian I always wrote that he was the most important agent that the agency had, because he was operating daily and effectively as a member of the Office of Secretary of Defense. And you can think of the things that a person in that capacity can do when his home base really is CIA. Well, although people didn't believe this when they first heard it, there are assignments like that in the White House. There are assignments like that in the State Department. It's hard to tell the difference, you might say, between Bill Bundy, who was a longtime CIA employee, and McGeorge Bundy, who was in the White House with Kennedy. The two brothers certainly want to act side by side. They have the same goals and the same intentions. Well, there were many things that duplicated like that. So that it wasn't long before, and I'd say by the end of the 50s, early 60s, before we had spread through the government what I called a secret team, a group of people who really knew how to operate the CIA business.
Okay.
This business of the inner team of workers, all actually operating within the law. There was once in a while some aberration, but we usually found it and brought it to Mr. Dull's attention. But generally working within the law could get rather phenomenal things done. For example, one day I got a call from the agency. They had heard of the capability of a new aircraft that had been designed at MIT, and they wanted to know if the Air Force had an interest in it. Well, the Air Force hardly knew about it. I had seen a picture of it in the newspaper. And I said, well, let me find out what we can do about that. I called the company, a small company, but it had very preeminent people, Dr. Coppin from MIT and Dr. Bollinger from Harvard Business School, and a lot of very good aircraft designers and builders in the company. So the company was solidly on the ground, but it was a very small company. And I told the man that I was talking to that I was from the Air Force, I was a colonel in the Air Force, and that we had an interest in this small plane for certain special activities, and that I would send a representative of my office up there to talk with them. Well, I called in a CIA man, the same man that had called me, and I said, look, you're from my office. Here's some credentials. You go up there, you see this company, you know what you want. And I didn't know whether they'd really want the plane or not, but they decided they did. In fact, they wanted hundreds of them, something that company had never heard of before, orders in that number. And sure enough, we bought hundreds of those airplanes for the CIA, technically for the Air Force. The Air Force had no concern with this because the CIA money paid for it. Didn't cost us anything. But we didn't go through the Air Force procurement procedures at all. We just completely went just like a civilian buying airplanes. And the CIA was delighted with the plane. They used them. They used so many of them in Southeast Asia that there was a flyer's handbook with what were called helio strips. In other words, air landing grounds that only the helio airplane could land on, because it could land a very short, and it was under control right down to the ground. So these little runways were hardly suitable for helicopters, and this little helio plane was operating regularly. And, well, millions and millions of dollars were poured into that exercise. A lot of people were involved in it, and it never went through any Air Force procurement. Now, the cleared individual, the man in the team, in the procurement offices, made papers that covered up this gap. There were papers in the files, but they had never been worked on. They were simply dummy papers in the files. Now, we could do things like that with no trouble at all. The U-2 was started like that. That's how the U-2 got off the ground. Ostensibly purchased by the Air Force, but not paid for by the Air Force, and so on. So when I say that this team was quite effective, it was very effective, very strong, handled a lot of money, worked all over the world. Thousands of people were involved. And I know one time when I was speaking to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, at that time General Lemnitzer, he said, you know, I've known of 2 or 3 units in the Army that were supporting CIA. He said, but you're talking about quite a few. He said, how many were there? Well, at that time, there were 608. Well, General Lemnitzer had no idea of it. And it's amazing. Here's the top man in the military, and he had no idea that we were supporting that many CIA units. Not military units. They were phony military units. They were operating with military people, but they were controlled entirely. They were financed by the CIA. 608 of them. And I'm sure that from my day it increased. I know it didn't decrease. So people don't understand the size and the nature of this clandestine activity that is designed for clandestine operations all over the world. And it goes back again to things we've spoken of earlier, that activity must be under somebody's control. There is no law for the control of covert operations other than at the National Security Council level. And if the National Security Council does not sign the directives, issue the directives for covert operations, then nobody does. And that's when it becomes a shambles, as we saw in the Contra affair and in other things. But the National Security Council steps in and directs it and holds that control, then things are run properly. And we've seen that during the last decade there's been quite a few aberrations, whether we're talking about Iran or Latin America or even part of the Vietnam War itself. In fact, it was in the Vietnam War where the thing really began to come apart. It just outgrew itself, and the leadership role disintegrated. And we see the worst of it in the Iran-Contra affair.
sort of following on that, you write about them, Dulles being able to move them up and deeper into their covered jobs. Would this be a function of them being there longer than the people who would be promoted to something else in time?
Yes. When we put them in, they might be somebody's assistant. And they've been there for 3 years, and the man that was above them, who was probably a political appointee, leaves, and they might move this man up there. Or when a new political appointee comes, he has no knowledge that this man is really from CIA. He's just a strong person in his office, and he gives him a broader role. Sometimes these people were working. One man I know was in FAA, and we needed his work to help us with FAA as a focal point there. He had been there so long, the FAA had him in a very big, very responsible job, and you might say 90% of his work was regular FAA work, a very, very strong individual. Well, that meant that when we needed him to help us with some of our activities on the covert side of things, he was in a much better position to handle this than he had been originally. This happened with quite a few, and that's why I say in the case of Frank Hand, he had been in the Defense Department so long that he was able to handle really major operations that weren't even visualized at the time he was assigned. And this carries over into many other things. You know, I pointed out that the Office of Special Operations under General Erskine had the responsibility for the National Security Agency as well as CIA contacts and the State Department and so on. Well, as we filled up these positions, some of them became dominant in some of those organizations, such as NSA. Early people in this program have created quite a career for themselves in other work. For instance, a young man in this system was Major Haig, Major Al Haig. He went up through the system. He was working as a deputy to the Army's cleared focal point officer for agency support matters, who was the General Counsel of the Army, a man named Joe Califano, a very prominent lawyer today. When the General Counsel of the Army was moved up into the Office of Secretary of Defense later in McNamara's office, he carried with him this then Lieutenant Colonel Al Haig up to the Office of Secretary of Defense. And during the Johnson administration, when they moved to the White House, Califano and Haig moved to the White House. Then during the Nixon time, Haig, with all his experience in the White House, worked with Kissinger, and you can see that it was this attachment through the covert side which gave Haig his ability to do an awful lot of things that people didn't understand, because he had this whole team behind him. Yeah. Well, to be even more up to date, there was a Major Secord in our system, and Major Secord is the same General Secord you've been reading about in the Iran-Contra business. A lot of these people worked right up into the White House, and there were these same assigned people, even at the White House level, that really were working on this CIA covert work rather than the jobs that they seemed to hold, that the public understood it was the job that they were working for. It's a much more effective system people have thought it was.
The last sentence you said, today the role of the CIA is performed by an ad hoc organization that is much greater in size, strength, and resources than the CIA has ever been visualized to be. You alluded to this before. What is your sense of what this ad hoc organization encompasses today?
Well, you see, we've said this quite a few times, that there is no law, there is no structure for covert operations. The government didn't confront that in 1947 when they wrote the law.
Right.
There has been no revision of the law to accommodate that. There have been decisions by the National Security Council which do assign covert operations, primarily to CIA, but on a time-to-time basis. In fact, one of the strongest of these papers, if I remember the designation, was NSC 10/2, was in my files early in the business back in 1955. And I remember that on the side of the paper, written in pencil and in his own hand, President Eisenhower had written that any time a decision had been made for the Defense Department to support the agency with arms, equipment, money, people, bases, etc., that the equipment was to be limited to that one time only and withdrawn. He did not want the CIA to create a capability that was ongoing, as he was very specific about it. Well, that was 1955. Those things changed with the times, and they got more powerful and more powerful. And because of that kind of growth, you don't have the legal structure, you don't have the approved structure. It's an ad hoc creation.
Yeah.
Probably the strongest ad hoc creation in our government today.
Wow. Again, focusing on this Dulles-Jackson career report, you write, the CIA has the authority, or at least it is given the authority by other government agencies, to create cover organizations within other parts of the government. This is one of the key tasks that the old Dulles-Jackson career report set out to accomplish. And a couple of questions that I really have about this is, one is, how is it that other government agencies give the CIA the authority to create CIA cover organizations within themselves?
It's more simple than you visualize. What we do, after all of the government is willing to cooperate with and work with other parts of the government at any time. If it was the Department of Agriculture, we'd never have any trouble working with them and so on. So we understand that. That's a given in the beginning.
Okay.
But what we would do is we would have a top-level meeting, either with Alan Dulles or somebody like Dick Helms or Frank Wisner or one of those people, would pay a call directly on the head of this department. And since I've mentioned it before, I'll say the FAA. So you would go to the Federal Administrator for the Federal Aviation Administration, and we'd say, look, it's necessary from time to time that the CIA has to operate aircraft, perhaps a little differently than your regulations specify because we're doing a clandestine operation. Or perhaps our aircraft, we have to have two aircraft with the same number on them at the same time. So if that ever turns up on one of your control towers that an airplane lands this morning and its tail number is 1234, another plane comes in this afternoon of the same type and its tail number is 1234, don't do anything about it. Just it's a covert operation that we're operating. And they would agree to it. They'd say, fine. Then Mr. Dulles would say, I'd like to assign a person to your administration as a focal point officer so that anything comes up like this, anybody in the FAA will contact that man, or vice versa. He'll contact them ahead of time to say, we're running this kind of a covert mission, and your people will know about it. We never ran into a problem with that. And if the workload was heavy, we'd augment that man. He'd have 2 people, 3 people. Or if there was something that was going to last for 3 months or 6 months, we might put 10 people there. And when we went to take the 10 people back, we might take 5 back and leave the 5 there. So that over a period of years, what had started as just a simple focal point office became a very large one. When I created Team B in the Air Force as a focal point office, I had 1 assistant and 1 secretary. In short order, I had several thousand people around the world. Wow. Things just grow by the job.
By the nature of the work.
Yeah.
This is tied in with all the rest, as of course discussions of the CIA would be, concerning the fact that the National Security Act of 1947 was quite strict with reference to money for the CIA. Discuss the impact of the CIA Act of 1949, which made it possible for the agency to have no trouble at all getting adequate funds.
I think without any question, the secret of covert operation is the control of money. And that begins with having an account, a good-sized account, and the means to use it throughout the government. By 1949, the CIA was able to convince Congress that many of the things they were doing were perfectly legitimate, and that many of the things they were doing cost money because they were paying for people in other government agencies. They were paying their salaries. You see, when these people were assigned, as I said, when General LeMay promoted Lansdale to be general, it didn't cost the Air Force anything. His paycheck came from CIA, and the Air Force paycheck would be torn up. It would go to a certain office where they would destroy it, and it didn't cost the Air Force anything. In 1949, the then Secretary of Defense, a man named Lewis Johnson, wrote a very important paper with respect to covert operations. He said that the Department of Defense would support the CIA in any of its approved covert operations fully, provided that the CIA would reimburse the Department of Defense for all out-of-pocket costs. They wouldn't have to reimburse for the purchase price of an aircraft because the Air Force had that, but they would have to reimburse for the cost of operating that aircraft, for the cost of any other facilities required, even for the salaries of crews that were assigned to that aircraft over a period of time. This philosophy of reimbursement is very important in covert operations because it keeps bills from appearing in public that would stir up questions about, why was this money spent when it wasn't spent for the line budgeted items. So when we created the Tab 6 system, we worked the reimbursement system in throughout so that you never saw the spending of any money. The Air Force never spent any money on the CIA operations, technically.
Yeah.
The money was immediately transferred through a comptroller's office arrangement up in the Office of Secretary of Defense, and that money was actually agency money. Well, within a few years, the agency was able to point out to Congress that a lot of money was flowing in that channel because effectively they were paying for very high-cost equipment, aircraft, submarines, even aircraft carriers in a few places, very expensive things to operate on a reimbursable basis. So based on that, the agency began to get a much larger budget. Then when they went into the U-2 and when they went into space programs, that budget grew considerably. And since it was a completely, totally classified budget and almost non-accountable, the DCI has the authority to spend that money simply on his signature. He doesn't have to account for it. It's a very rare thing in budget process, but the Congress goes along with that. And as a result, because of the law of 1949, which permitted this activity, and the letter from Lewis Johnson, the policy statement that we would carry out all our work on a reimbursable basis, and other departments and agencies of the government followed that procedure, the agency was allocated a considerable amount of money after 1949, and it was under their own control.
Could you comment on the fact then that, quoting from the book, more important than the dollars the agency gets is what can be done, is what it can do with those dollars to make them cover all sorts of research, development, procurement, real estate ventures, stockpiles, and anything else money will buy, including tens of thousands of people who do not show on any official rosters.
Yeah, one of the most interesting results of this horizontal application of money or reimbursement is that it can be used to pay salaries without explaining that they were for salaries. They're just an expenditure of money. The DCI would sign it off as an expense, but it might have paid for the salaries of 100 people. Well, I don't know how familiar you are with the way government handles its people, but each department and agency has a certain stated number of people that are budgeted for because they have to be paid every year, their pensions have to be paid, some of them have insurance and other obligations of the government, so they're very carefully monitored. This is one of the few places in the government where money equal people. Mm-hmm. And if you're paying people, we'll say $20,000 a year, and you spend $100,000 for 5 people, the $100,000 did not say it was for 5 people, whereas all the rest of the government did. And this enabled us to put people into programs that were not visible. Well, if you carry it out to other things, the same, we are able to buy aircraft that were not visible. We're able to buy radars that were not visible. So that the money in this method of operation is truly concealed in a budget without anybody. Congress doesn't know where it is. And I don't think they've ever made any attempt to try to find out where it is. They allocate a bulk sum and then just sit back. Well, there's no end to the things you can do with money that way. The agency, during my period of operation with them, for instance, had an account with the big banks in Wall Street that is like seed incorporated, street name accounts. I don't know whether you're familiar with that finance term or not, but one of the biggest of the street name accounts is Seed Incorporated, C-E-D-E. And this is where money is that's between transactions on the stock market. It's got to be somewhere, so they assign it to Seed and Company. Well, Seed is nobody. It's just under the control of major banks, and the money's flowing. But while it flows, it has to belong to somebody, especially when it's in big numbers. Well, the CIA had, and may still have, a street name called Suydam, S-U-Y-D-A-M. And when money was in the Suydam account, I don't think the financiers knew it, maybe a few did, but it was CIA's money. Because some of the things they did, like, for example, operate Air America, in order to cover Air America's operation, they would have to do some commercial work. So they had quite an income from this huge airline. And that money would be put into the Suydam account. And it interested me one time when I had a breakdown of the Suydam account to find out that an awful lot of CIA money had been invested in a major supermarket chain in this country. And in today's world, they might have been able to take over the operation of the supermarket. But it was just a quick place to put money that the CIA had made and would spend later in their own operations. And it got to be very large amounts of money at time. Well, if I were in Congress today, I think I'd take a look at that, because you see, sometimes when you hear about the money being handled for the Contras or the sale of things to Iranians and everything, you begin to realize there is an awful lot of potential for money to be handled there without being accounted for. Well, we saw that back in the days when we did account for it, and I think people would be surprised to find out that it was such a large activity.
Mm-hmm. This brings us to a degree with other ways of spending the money. One of the ways that the CIA, apparently from reading your book, as far as my understanding goes, was able to develop these cover units around the world that would hold equipment that would be earmarked for its use, even though it might be labeled a military unit, was through early aspects of CIA being able to involve itself in the war plans that were developed in the late 40s, early 50s that tried to combine nuclear strategies with conventional strategies. You write, as a result of the war planning role of the CIA, it was easy for the CIA planners to enter in the plans of all armed forces requirements for wartime equipment, vehicles, aircraft, and facilities that had to be earmarked and stockpiled for use by the agency in the event of war. Once such requirements were listed in the war plans, they could be requisitioned along with all other war plan material. This meant that the cost of this equipment would be worked into the military budget, and then in due time, each item would be purchased and delivered to the advanced base site where war plan material was stockpiled. Warehouse after warehouse of, quote, military equipment, unquote, is stored in the Far East, in Europe, and throughout the United States for the eventual use of the CIA. The cost of this material and of its storage, care, and conditioning is inestimable. As the years passed, and as the agency's, quote, military role became more a matter of custom and generally accepted, agency military cover units became so deeply covered that their neighboring military units did not know or forgot that the unit near them was not a regular military unit. By that time, requisitions from these CIA units were as readily acceptable as any others, and the units became easily self-supporting without any agency funding input. From this, I'd like you to please discuss this rise and growth of the logistical global network of the support side of the CIA, and how the existence of this relatively unknown component of the support section is fundamental to the CIA's ability to engage in clandestine operations.
You see, this grew out of the natural war planning function of the military. And right after World War II and on into the early 50s, we visualized that a war would begin with some attack, we'll say on the NATO lines, more or less like conventional World War II, but that it would immediately elevate to the nuclear exchange. It was planned that in that nuclear exchange, we would try to preserve certain areas in the target country, say the Soviet Union, that would not be hit, and judging by meteorological data, would not be covered by fallout, which would be radioactive for years and years, and that in that area we would have the CIA create certain network agent functions and groups of people that we could immediately send Special Forces by Paradrop in, and this is the original Special Forces function, not the contrived one that grew on the Vietnam War. Well, with this in the war plan, then this becomes a matter of the basic military budget each year. And with the CIA considered a fourth force, Army, Navy, Air Force, and CIA, what the CIA needed for its war planning functions on behalf of the United States government, the total government, would then be treated as part of the military budget, not the agency's budget. Well, in the beginning, this amounted to trucks, aircraft, weapons, all these things that they would, radios and everything else, that they visualized their function would require right after the, what we used to call, post-strike function. The agency learned that this worked pretty good, and they had warehouses under their name, in the name of a military unit. We would say, for instance, we'd create a unit, the 234 Provisional Support Group. And the 234 Provisional Support Group in Germany, staffed with all military people, of course CIA people in military uniforms, would begin to fill its warehouses. And they'd have trucks and jeeps and guns and radios and everything else, ambulances, the whole works, everything else the rest of the military had. So the agency was quick to see that if they visualized their post-strike function as bigger this year than it was last year, they'd have more things put in the warehouse. And then, since NATO exercises are run every year to train in the war plan, they would have to have more and more equipment for the NATO exercises, and they did a very good job of filling their warehouses, and then in using this equipment on, quote, exercises, which really were covert operations. So this was an area in this business of reimbursement we weren't able to keep up with. We knew it existed, we knew what they were doing, we supplied the equipment, and it was sort of an even exchange. We figured, well, we've told the agency there to be the fourth force, they're going to do a job in wartime, might as well let them use it and train themselves and everything else. So first thing we knew, the agency was able, despite President Eisenhower's warning, to create quite a force, and they had a lot of aircraft of their own, they had trucks of their own, they had all this equipment. And this was the way that they ran their business under the war plan. I don't know what has happened to that in today's world. I assume it has grown and not been, not gone. I have never heard anything about it since the days when I worked on it regularly. I think if anybody looked into the war planning in the Far East or in Europe, they would find that this still exists under one cover or other, and that it explains the reason why the agency is able to get equipment immediately for almost any covert activity in any part of the world. Just as an example, when we heard a lot about the Nicaraguan, Contra, El Salvador problems in Latin America during the last decade, I noticed that the plane that went down with a man named Hassenfuss on board was a C-123. Well, that was one of these airplanes in the agency's stockpile. It was an Air Force plane, but it was one used by the agency. I knew the designation. Very few people have ever heard of an airplane called a Chase. But the 122 was designed by an airplane company called Chase Aircraft. 123 was a modification of that. And with things like that, you can see that the agency is still operating within this same structure of the fourth force concept. And I imagine it still exists.
Uh-huh. And you describe what seems to be a very enlightening day, an event in 1960 or 61 when you briefed the chairman of the JCS, Joint Chiefs of Staff, on a matter that had come up involving the CIA and the military. As you described it, the chairman was General Lyman L. Limnitzer, and his commandant was General David M. Shoup. They were close friends and had known each other for years. When the primary subject of the briefing had ended, General Limnitzer asked me about the Army cover unit that was involved in the operation. I explained what its role was, and more or less added that this was a rather routine matter. Then he said, "Prouty, if this is routine, yet General Shoup and I have never heard of it before, can you tell me in round numbers how many Army units there are that exist as cover for the CIA?" I replied that to my knowledge at that time there were about 605 such units, some real, some mixed, and some that were simply telephone drops. When he heard that, he turned to General Shoup and said, "You know, I realized that we provided cover for the agency from time to time, but I never knew that we had anywhere near so many permanent cover units and that they existed all over the world." I then asked General Lemnitzer if I might ask him a question. He said I could. "General," I said, "during all of my military career, I have done one thing or another at the direction of a senior officer. In all of those years and in all of those circumstances, I have always believed that someone, either at the level of the officer who told me to do what I was doing, or further up the chain of command, knew why I was doing what I had been directed to do, and that he knew what the reason for doing it was. Now I am speaking to the senior military officer in the armed forces, and I have just found out that some things I have been doing for years in support of the CIA have not been known, and that they have been done most likely in response to other authority. Is this correct?" This started a friendly, informal, and most enlightening conversation, more or less to the effect that where the CIA was concerned, there were a lot of things no one seemed to know. Can you recount more of the details of this enlightening conversation for us?
Well, you know, I referred to it earlier, that it astounded me that day. I assumed that there were a lot of things that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was not aware of every day in the Air Force, in the Navy, and in the CIA. But I had never expected such a blanket answer that he didn't know, and that General Shoup didn't. Now, what we were talking about was rather specific. At the time of the rebellion in Indonesia, when the CIA supported tens of thousands of troops with aircraft and ships and submarines, everything else, in an attempt to overthrow the government of Sukarno, we needed rifles pretty quick to support these rebels, and I called out to Okinawa and found that the Army didn't have enough rifles for what we wanted, 42,000 rifles. They had about 30,000. But that he said he thought he could get, so General Lemnitzer said, General Lemnitzer was a commander in the Ryukyu's command at that time, Okinawa. So he was right up close to this thing. He said that he'd have somebody call the Marine Corps and see what he could get from them. Well, it just happened that General Shoup was the head of the Marine unit at Okinawa, and he said, sure, he could provide the extra 12,000. So without delay, we had 4-engine aircraft, C-54s, flown by Air America crews, but under military cover, appeared to be military aircraft, come into Okinawa and pick up these 42,000 rifles prepared for airdrop in Indonesia. They'd fly down the Philippines and down to another base we had and then over into Indonesia and drop these rifles. Well, of course, we replaced those rifles. The general didn't know where they were going. We just borrowed them, and the unit that borrowed them was military, and the call had come from the Pentagon. You had no problem with supplying the rifles. So years later, we replaced them. Well, then when I told him about that in the Pentagon, he said, you know, he never knew where those rifles went. And General Shoup said, you know, Lem, he said, when you asked me for 12,000 rifles, I thought you wanted them, and of course, being a good Marine, I gave you 12,000 rifles. He said, you owe me 12,000. They were sitting there kidding, but they never knew they went to Indonesia. You see, they never knew they were part of a covert operation going into Indonesia. Well, this is true of a lot of things that go on. We kept the books in the Pentagon. We covered that. We got reimbursement for it. That part of it was all right, and that's what kept it from a problem, because as long as General Lemnitzer's forces got the 30,000 rifles back and Shoup got the 12,000 back for the total of 42,000, they didn't complain to anybody. They had their full strength of rifles, you see. That's the magic of reimbursement. Well, this kind of thing, on an established basis, the units are there. When I said there are 605 units, those are operating units. Now, some of them may only be telephone drops because that's their function. They don't need a whole lot of people. They're just handling supplies or something like that. But put this in present terms. When Colonel North believed that he had been ordered to take 2008 TOW missiles and deliver them to Iran, see, there has to be some way that the supply system can let those go. You can't just drive down there with a truck in San Antonio at the warehouse and say, I want 2008 missiles. You have to have authority. And 2008 TOW missiles, I don't know what one of them cost, but it's an awful lot of money. And somebody had to prepare the paperwork for the authorization to let the supply officer release those, and I'm sure they went to a cover unit that North was using for that purpose. But it appears from what we've heard from this that unlike the way we used to run the cover operations, when these things got to Iran, these characters sold them for money. In fact, they sold them for almost 4 times the listed value of these things. And this is the problem Congress has been having, is what happened to the money after they got that. And you can see how the system developed. You see, originally we developed it on this one-for-one reimbursement basis. Another thing is we never use this kind of supply to deliver grenades to the Contras and charge them $9 a grenade or whatever it was. We just delivered the grenades. It was part of a government program. And the CIA would reimburse the Defense Department. Everything came out even. We didn't sell anything, you see. So I know how it worked in the 50s and 60s, but I can't tell you how it's been working in the 80s. I'm just astounded by what developed. But just like the general not knowing this, we had so many units in so many places around the world. And for instance, we learned that a scientist, as I recall at Caltech, had learned how to listen to radio transmission that was so brief that a whole paragraph would be a blip, electronic blip, milliseconds. And he learned to stretch that millisecond blip into readable language. He did it with, I think what electronics experts would say, and I certainly am not one of them, is like this characteristic of the cathode tube that when you turn the thing off for a little while it still glows. Well, this was called, well, I can't remember in a moment, but the Rambo effect. And Dr. Rambo realized he could do that with radio wave just as well as the cathode tube could do it. And the Soviets were using this blip transmission on CW wave, constant wave, like LORAN, to deliver secret messages. Well, the minute CIA heard about that, obviously they wanted the capability. So we used an Air Force unit to go to one of the major radio suppliers, electronic suppliers for the Air Force, and by feeding CIA dollars into that ongoing contract and without raising any eyebrows at all, we had that company over a period of about a year and a half develop a super receiver capability that could listen to the CW tone, discover that millisecond blip on there, stretch the blip to readable language, and then get a translator to translate from Russian to American. Well, now, that's a tremendous achievement when you think about it, because it broke the whole system of that kind of cryptology, and it did it with dollars that never affected the Defense Department, but we used the defense structure to do it so that the company that did it had no idea that they were dealing with the CIA. They just thought it was a part of an ongoing Air Force contract. That's one of the way these things are done. There's a major company in this country in the Fortune 500 listing called EG&G. It's Edgerton, Germershausen, and Greer. And most of their work is in a very highly classified area of operations for the U.S. government. Well, I'm not sure to this day that EG&G realizes that in their earlier days, when they were a somewhat smaller company, much of the funding that went into their company came through this channel from the CIA to the Air Force and to EG&G, so that EG&G would develop these very, very special things, really for covert operations, not for Air Force or Army. But there's a lot of companies that have had those contracts, and this is not a small operation. And the only thing that bothered me, and it bothers me today, was that there was no way to let the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff know this. Now, I think my role, since I was had just been assigned to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, my work, if you'll remember my earlier bio material, I was 5 years with the Air Force and then 2 years with the Office of Secretary of Defense. And then Mr. McNamara decided to transfer that to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Well, one of my functions there was to become a briefing officer for the chairman so he would know what was going on. Mm-hmm. And I think we served quite a purpose there, because from that time on, every time we got into one of these things, I would brief him right away. And that at least kept him alert to this. Now, again, I fail to see that function, we'll say, in this Iran-Contra era. I don't think anybody from NSC was going down to the chairman or the secretaries of the various departments of the military, and saying, this is what we're doing, or this is, just to keep them current. After all, they have the right to know all this, see?
Right.
It's an important function. It's a much larger function, much more costly function than people realize that it is. And because of the odd way this country has decided to do covert operations, it's almost uncontrolled, except for NSC. And if NSC does not do their job, then it is uncontrolled. And this is the big issue today, even after Ollie North's trial. The NSC members are sitting back and saying, we didn't do any of it. It seems to me the jurors realize they did. They think Reagan was involved, Bush was involved, Weinberger was involved. They had to be involved, you know. But this is the breakdown right now, and we're going to have a hard time restructuring this business again, because all covert operations require foreign alliances. They're all bilateral. You can't take an aircraft and make a power drop in Tibet without letting the Indian government know that you are using their airways to fly to Tibet for an illegal or a covert drop. So we would notify the Indian government, you see, or we'd notify the Pakistani government or the government of Thailand and so on. In almost every covert, in fact, I can hardly think of any way to operate a covert operation without at least a bilateral agreement. Well, if we don't have our agreements in order, how on earth can we work with these other people around the world? And this is serious business. And this is why the other countries around the world have begun to lose faith in the things that we're doing, because either we're not telling them or we're getting them involved in something that they don't want to be involved in. You know, they don't want to be even connected with it.
One or two more follow-ups then. What was the sense among the three of you talking there about the implications that where the CIA was concerned, there were a lot of things no one seemed to know?
As I recall that meeting, my office had just been moved from the Office of the Secretary of Defense into the Joint Chiefs of Staff structure. It was a very formal structure. At that time, it was legally controlled at 400 officers, and even to move my small office down there, they had to increase the congressional approval of the more than 400 limit on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So it was an important move when they made it. Now, although I may have joked a little bit about the generals not knowing that such an enormous organization existed around the world in our support of CIA, they were very serious about it. They felt that it was a real oversight to have this sort of thing going on without review. And I'm of the opinion that this is one of the real reasons why the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Mr. McNamara had agreed to establish this Office of Special Operations within the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so that all the military forces would be treated equally in their supporting activities in the CIA, and so that the chairman would always be briefed on what was going on in covert work. And in the support of covert work, which goes on every day, the covert operation might be 10 days, but we're supporting them year-round. It was a serious business, and they recognized it as such.
You write further on that by the time of the Bay of Pigs operation, the CIA was part of a greater team which used the agency and other parts of the government to carry out almost any secret operation it wanted. By that time, this organization had the equipment, the facilities, the men, and the funds to carry out clandestine operations that were so vast that even on the basis of simple definition, they were no longer truly secret, nor could anyone hope that they might be. The availability of supplies and facilities made it possible for all of this to come about. The growth of the CIA and of the greater secret team has resulted more from the huge success of the Deputy Director of Support side of the agency than from either the Deputy Director of Plans or the Deputy Director of Intelligence. Please comment on the importance you ascribe to this Deputy Director of Support side of the agency.
Well, it's one thing to have an approval to carry out a covert operation. and then to be able to go to the Defense Department or any other part of the government and get support for that operation. It's a completely other thing to have warehouses full of equipment, ships, aircraft, and people all over the world, and be able to carry on covert operation in a regular basis. And by you've used a good point of reference, the Bay of Pigs. By 1960, when President Eisenhower approved the early actions that later led to the Bay of Pigs, and these were very, very small matters, the agency was able itself to schedule a program that they knew was going to be a major program. Any of us in covert operation knows that 3,000 men in a program that led to putting, 1,200, 1,300 on a beach in a foreign country is not covert. You can't train 3,000 men in Guatemala, Nicaragua, some unfortunately in Mexico by inadvertence, and operate radio stations off islands in the Caribbean, etc., and call it covert. It's just a joke. The New York Times was reporting on the program almost daily. Castro was broadcasting about its threat almost daily, and yet it was called a covert program. The thing that was against being covert was its size. But, be that as may, the CIA had the aircraft. They had the B-26s. In fact, as I think I said sometime earlier, we had created for the Cuban exiles an air force, a tactical combat air force that was larger than any air force in Latin America at the time. And that came from CIA assets. That was their aircraft. There were planes that were used in the Indonesia business. They took planes back from the Vietnam theater. They used a lot of C-54s that Air America had put together. As a matter of fact, it's very interesting what they did do. They even brought Philippine Army officers who had worked with General Lansdale in the Magsaysay campaign in the Philippines back in the 50s. They even brought some of those officers into Guatemala to do the training there. See, they had the facilities that were worldwide and involving people even from other governments. So this is what they had gotten into existence in time to run something like this anti-Castro program. Yet, when it started, the first request the agency made to the Department of Defense, when they got the approval from Eisenhower to start this anti-Castro move, was for 2 Navy doctors. That's all they needed. They said, we need 2 Navy doctors. The Navy did not want to give up 2 doctors at that time. They didn't have 2 that they could do it because it was a long-term, indeterminate period. So the CIA men came to my office and they said, could we get 2 Air Force doctors? Most of our doctors were flight surgeons. We did not want to give them up. But I talked to the chief surgeon in the Air Force, and he had a few doctors at that time, I think at Lackland Air Base in Texas, that would be willing to do this on a voluntary basis and that he could spare. So it happened that we sent 2 Air Force doctors to begin the program. That is all it was. They didn't ask for anything else. Here's the anti-Castro program beginning, and they wanted 2 doctors. Of course, we asked them why. The reason was that they were going to put hundreds of Cuban exile men who were enrolled in the Army at a small military base that belonged to the U.S., was used by the U.S. in Panama. And they needed doctors because the men would be in the base in Panama. They didn't ask us for equipment. They didn't ask for airplanes and rifles and all, trucks and everything. They had that. So they could, just by filling in with a few things they didn't have, they were ready to go. And they were ready to go more than we thought. They had a lot of capability. Within a month or so, they were building a big air base over near Talaleo in Guatemala. And they did this themselves. Bulldozers and every other darn thing. And, of course, with their money, they bought for the construction. So by the time of the 1960s, the agency could run major operations, major warfare, you might call it, by themselves. Well, this led to an interesting bit of political development, because during the summer of '60, we were using primarily World War II transport aircraft called a C-46, carry 40 or 50 people or carry a pretty good sized cargo. We'd fly it from Guatemala or Nicaragua to Cuba. We would not fly it from the United States. We didn't want any reference to the United States. They still thought they were playing a covert game. and we'd make airdrops in Cuba. Well, this was a kind of a touch-and-go game, and many of the airdrops just disappeared. They didn't drop to the right people, or Castro found out about it and intercepted it for him. But in any case, that's what they were doing, small airdrops, and mostly of equipment, weapons, communications gear, to what they thought were people on the ground who would handle it in the anti-Castro movement. Well, that went on until the political campaign of 1960, and it was pretty active. And the most active person on this from the administration side was Richard Nixon, and he was running for president and against Kennedy. In the very close election, when Kennedy won, within a week the agency came in and told us that they were planning for a force of 3,000 Cuban exiles, and that their target would be an invasion of Cuba. Well, this was something they developed themselves. I know very well from the repeated dealings we had with the White House from March of 60 until November of 60, that President Eisenhower never authorized an invasion of Cuba. But the agency, able to plan for that themselves, and realizing Eisenhower was in a lame duck position after the election, and that Kennedy, although he knew about this training program, had no idea what the limitations put on it were, would probably accept this kind of thing. They just moved it from small airdrop things or over the beach. We put a lot of teams over the beach from pontoon raft equipment and that kind of thing. And the next thing you know, we were in this big program. So that when Allen Dulles and Richard Bissell briefed Kennedy, I think in the end of November or December of 60, down at Kennedy's home in Palm Beach, they were talking of a 3,000-man force, not these little intermittent airdrops. I think there's two things here, though, that the agency wasn't aware of. Kennedy knew the Cuban leaders. One of Kennedy's close friends was Senator Smathers of Florida. Senator Smathers had connections with all the Cuban people in Florida, and I think he had briefed Kennedy. Because in an interesting little event, I was asked one day to go from the Pentagon to the Senate office building to Senator Kennedy's office, and to take a car that could carry 6 people, the driver, myself, and 4 passengers. So I went over to the Senate office building, went into Kennedy's office, and I sat there for a few minutes, and the senator came out and shaking hands goodbye to 4 men who were Cubans. I could tell by their Spanish accent, tell by the names that Kennedy called them, and they seemed like old friends. Kennedy was patting one of them on the back and, well, I'll see what we can do for you and all that sort of thing. And then the senator turned to me and he said, the Secretary of Defense wants to meet these people. You please take them back to the Pentagon to see the Secretary of Defense. Well, those 4 men, one of them was Manuel Artima. Artima was the commanding officer on the beach of the brigade in Cuba. Kennedy knew Artima, and he had talked with Artima. He knew what Artima's plans were. The other man, Mendonca, was one of a former, I believe, former president of Cuba for a short time. There was a man named De Verona, who was one of the leaders of the Cuban exile group, and I can't recall the 4th man, but that's the type of people they were. They were the top people that Allen Dulles had put together for the Cuban exile group, and here was Kennedy meeting them privately in his own office. He knew them ahead of time. So the people that think Kennedy didn't know what was going on don't understand how much experience Kennedy had with this kind of thing.
When do you think that meeting really was?
This took place in August of 1960, just about the same time that Kennedy had announced he was going to run for president.
He'd already gotten the nomination by, you mean?
Pardon?
In August of 60, they'd already had the Democratic convention that summer.
Well, I'm talking about the same period. These were almost, this period was almost identical. And in fact, I can tell you how we can pin the date down. There's no question about it. Artima had just come from addressing the annual American Legion Convention in Detroit that year, which I believe was in August of 1960. So these things were happening one right on top of the other, you see. But the most important thing was that later on people were saying, well, Nixon knew all about this brigade going into Cuba, but Kennedy didn't know about it. Kennedy did. Yeah. He was smart. He kept it quiet. Well, as this force developed, by January of 1961, just before the inaugural, the agency was making regular plans for an invasion on the beach. And they brought in a Marine colonel named Jack Hawkins to head the tactical situation, to make the plans for it. And it was a very good plan. I think I mentioned earlier, they decided that the absolute fundament of the plan was to wipe out all Castro's combat aircraft, which meant the CIA was going to use their own aircraft, which had the combat capability. These were these B-26s that had been developed for the Indonesian campaign, and use them in air battles, go right over Cuba and destroy Castro's air force before they ever invaded the beach. This was a key to that program. Well, I'll go that far with this story because I don't think we're supposed to be talking about the Bay of Pigs. But you see, they could do these things themselves. Even the beginning of combat in Laos and combat in Vietnam were done with equipment that the agency owned by the period of 1960-61. It was a major combat force by that time.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, from your own experiences, that Allen Dulles knew back in the late 40s, or at least by the time he wrote the Dulles-Jackson Career Report, how important this component of the CIA would be?
You mean to develop the its
Logistics.
own? Well, of course, the thing that Mr. Dulles realized, and we must not downplay the ability of Jackson, who was actually was deputy director of the CIA for years too, a very knowledgeable man, and Matthias Correa. They realized that covert operations require materiel. And they also realize that if you don't have your own, you can't make your plans yourself. Having to make plans with borrowed equipment is always rather difficult. So you can see that in this, really, the reason I go back to this Jackson, Correa, Dulles document so often, and I think why I called it the Dulles Mein Kampf, was this was the plan of the future of CIA. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
And it was based upon having the ability to do it. The bases, the people, the airplanes, the ships, everything else.
Writing about some of the attempts of some senators to try to, or Congress people to try to have a little more oversight of this potentially runaway capabilities, you write, it was in 1955 that the then new Senator Mansfield, among others, attempted to get a law through the Congress that would establish a strong watchdog committee to oversee the CIA. One of the principal reasons this law did not pass was that such CIA stalwarts as Senator Russell and Senator Saltonstall affirmed that there was no need for such committees. I have worked closely with Senator Saltonstall and many others who were on those committees, and except in rare instances, they never knew that the CIA was so huge. They knew how big the CIA was within the bounds of the real or intelligence organization, but none of them knew about its tremendous global base capability, and what is much more important, none of them knew the intricacies of the agency's supporting system that existed in the name of the Army Special Forces and the Air Force, Air Supply, and Communications Wings. No one man or no one group of knowledgeable men have ever had the opportunity to see the whole picture. As I have heard Senator Saltonstall say, now don't tell me about that classified material. What I don't know won't hurt me. That has been a general attitude on Capitol Hill. In discussions I have had with responsible committeemen on the Hill, I have found this to exist as recently as September 1971. This situation has not changed much. There are no congressmen and no senators who really know what the agency, who know about the agency and about what the agency is doing. And I'd like you to discuss this crippling impact on the very essence of our constitutional form of government that is every day becoming more and more endemic because of elected officials betraying the responsibilities of their office when they indicate no desire whatsoever to be accurately appraised of classified material and its fundamental implications.
Well, of course, that varies with individuals and it varies with time, but it's a pretty accurate statement, unfortunately so. You see, in the eyes of Congress, when they created CIA, they were creating a coordinating organization. That doesn't give them too much power. So the congressman can sit back and say, look, we wrote the law, here's what the law says, and this is what we expect them to do. Except for one thing, the amount of money that they've been appropriating to this ever-expanding organization. So I can't excuse them for not realizing that there's a requirement for oversight. Where's the money going? Right. But then again, they sort of back out of that because only a few congressmen know how much money is appropriated. It's a very narrow area. But that doesn't mean they don't know, and it, again, is their responsibility. So they lean on the fact that, look, to control the CIA, we created an organization called the NSC. The President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense. If they can't control that organization, you know, those are our top people, then what are you talking to us about? See, it isn't Congress's job. And from that point of view, they're accurate. It is not up to the congressman to control the covert operations. It's up to the administration, because they're the ones that direct it, at least by law. So you can make a case for both sides. During my work with this activity, I was told frequently and regularly by senior officers in the Pentagon, generals and secretaries of departments and so on, to go over to the Congress and speak to the cleared congressman about what we were doing on a certain covert operation. I remember, I remember in my first clearance, it was explained to me that Senator Russell and Senator Saltonstall were the cleared officers, cleared senators. I went over to see them. Well, it just happened that Senator Saltonstall knew my father. My father knew Saltonstall pretty well. So when he heard my name, right away, how's your father, how's this? No, we got along just great. And then I said, now look, General Martin has sent me over here to talk to you about a covert operation, which CIA's run. Now look, if General Martin knows about that operation, and if the Defense Department is taking care of it, I don't need to know about that, Colonel, what I don't know. And really, this was the way it was handled. I wouldn't say that he meant it exactly that way, but it's what you get, because I know I wasn't able to tell him about it. He didn't want to hear it. The very fact that I came to tell him, I think, was simply enough to confirm that we were in some operation that he'd probably hear about later, especially if something went wrong, and that would do, that would suffice. But he wasn't going to sit there and be the conduit for everything we knew in the Defense Department between himself and then all the rest of the members of Congress. Right. He may have felt that if he told them about one operation, then they'd expect him to tell them about all of them, and that'd be bedlam for him too. But that's trying to make a case for him. What I can report to you is that in my many, many visits, both to Saltonstall and Russell, and then a lot of others, that's just two I recall, the general feeling was that if the operation had been directed by the President, by the NSC, and if the Defense Department was supporting the CIA, then it must be all right, must be official. You can't read it any other way. I mean, they weren't joking about this. It's just they were saying, we've set the system up, it should work. But as you can see, it proliferated into things that they didn't know about. And now, again, with the Iran-Contra thing, you have Congress saying, look, we didn't know anything about that at all. And we have NSC saying we don't know anything about it at all. See, so it does get worse and worse when you try to run things that way. But that was my own experience with it. I could not brief senators. They would not listen to it.
Because they felt it was in the proper hands that it should be?
Well, they thought, you know, the very fact that I was there proved to them that it must be in proper hands. You see, you can see the man's point of view.
Sure.
Because if I'm there to tell him, he's saying, okay, it must be a legitimate organization. If it was a real sneaky one, I wouldn't have been there, see? So that's his rationale.
Okay. You quote extensively from Lyman Kirkpatrick's book, The Real CIA, who you describe as a very exemplary officer and capable man, quoting in The Secret Team, quoting from the book, The Real CIA. Among the inner group of top agency careerists, this is talking about Kirkpatrick, he was a moderate and a most dedicated man. As a result of his statement, the excerpts from his book, The Real CIA, as a result, his statement takes on a very special meaning. It is an example of the blind statement of faith found in a religious order. The great error and the great damage, however, from this kind of thinking arises in the fact that it is predicated on the belief that the leaders of the agency can do no wrong, when the same organization is given the authority to develop and control all foreign secret intelligence, and to take its findings based upon the inputs of this secret intelligence directly to the last authority, the President, not only to take it to him regularly, but to preempt his time, attention, and energies almost to the point of making him their captive, and then also is given the authority and the vast means to carry out peacetime clandestine operations, that agency has been given the power to control the foreign operations of the government on a continuing day-to-day basis. Please comment on the effect or effects this sense of infallibility that the leaders of the agency felt imbued with had on the decisions and choices they made and on the goals they defined.
The first part of your question ought to be dealt with a little bit. Lyman Kirkpatrick, Ray Klein, Pierre de Silva are three men who have extensive agency experience who have written books. Fortunately, their books are better than most books that are written by outsiders. They don't try to hide things or change things or conceal things from the public. They are telling. Now, they don't write about certain things. They just don't put them in a book. But they are probably as reliable. I have a very large library of agency books, most of which are trash. But those three, from careerists, are quite responsible. And if I had to pick one, I would pick Lyman Kirkpatrick's as a pretty good. Now, remember, of course, it was written, 25 years ago. But it's still a good book. Lyman Kirkpatrick served in many capacities in the agency, and if it had not been for the unfortunate fact that he had a very serious case of paralysis and had to travel around in a wheelchair, I'm sure he would have followed Allen Dulles as the Director of Central Intelligence instead of Dick Helms, because not that Dick Helms would qualify, but Kirkpatrick would have followed Dulles. And that was unfortunate. So that what he says about the agency is generally accurate. And he was really, among his friends and acquaintances in the agency, a competent person and a reliable person, and I found him to be that way. Now, as we go along with the rest of this, read your question, because I reserved this idea about the writers, because, you see, the trouble with the agency, a problem the agency has, is that a lot of people write about it who really have never served a day with it, or if they have some axe to grind, one or the other. You know, another writer, it's hard to remember, who's the man that worked right in the agency's headquarters and wrote with Marx and,
John Marx?
You know...
his own book?
Oh, yeah, a really good book about the agency, yeah.
Not... John Stockwell or Ralph McGehee or... No,
earlier than that. Well, anyhow, it's hard to get a good book about the agency unless you've been an insider, no question about it. The other people that write have got some little angle or an axe to grind, and their books are not good. They're not accurate. So I wish to make that statement pretty clear while we have it on the record. Now, repeat the last question, and I'll circle back to the rest of you.
I'd like you to comment on the effect or effects this sense of infallibility that the leaders of the agency felt imbued with had on the decisions and choices they made and on the goals they defined.
Yeah. You see, to really understand CIA, you have to remember that perhaps its best cover story is that it's an intelligence organization. See, it doesn't do much intelligence. Intelligence is gathered by other assets throughout the government, among which today the agency has quite a bit, but that wasn't why they were created. In covert operations, which is their big money deal, you then divide up into like the mechanical and electronic things like U-2s and SR-71s and the satellites and all that, photographs and that whole business. Okay, that's the technical side of the agency. Then you get into this other part of covert operations where you're dealing with people and spies and agents and that sort of thing. Now, that's a business that almost